How's it going, folks? I'm Matthew. This is Lemora's Cards, and today we're looking at your hot takes. Not my hot takes this time. Maybe I'll sprinkle a couple of mine in response to yours. But I went to Twitter and I asked for you to reply with your hottest cEDH take, and I'll feature the best ones in a video. That's what we're going to be doing today. We're going to be breaking down some of your hot takes about the format, giving my opinions on them, maybe elaborating on some, playing a little devil's advocate. We'll see. I've taken a few peeks at them, but haven't really dove into them yet. So some of these will be more live reactions. Let me know down below which of these takes do you agree with, disagree with, some of your hot takes. Should I do more videos like this featuring some of your hot takes over on YouTube? While you're down there, like and go ahead and subscribe and consider supporting me on Patreon like these amazing patrons did. I have introduced a new tier to have me cover a tournament, get an entire tournament video over on Patreon. Check that out. If you're a tournament organizer or a player who wants to get an event featured, link down below, as well as other perks down there. With all that being said though, let's go ahead and hop into this. Use the link in the description below to download Whatnot, and you'll get $15 to use to buy Magic singles, sealed product, get anything that you want really. There's no limits. You just get $15 on the account for free just for signing up. This is one of the best ways you can support the channel. And again, it's just free stuff. Use the link in the description below. Give Whatnot a try. First up from Kai Fervent Alchemist, who has talked about this idea a lot on Twitter, saying seat order doesn't matter, you're just playing your seat wrong. And there's a couple of things we can kind of take from this, as you know, the general consensus is going first and second is a lot better than going third or fourth. First, I would say that these are two statements that are completely at odds together. If seat order doesn't matter, you can't be playing your seat wrong. Maybe being pedantic there, but those are just completely at odds statements. Both of those cannot be correct. I do think there is room for a discussion about playing to your seat position, and I think good players in general do that, and it's kind of an understood thing that if I'm a more reactive deck going behind more proactive decks, I probably need to prioritize ways to not lose the game, because getting my second or third turn not really as guaranteed as the, you know, turbo deck who's going first. They're a lot more likely to try to push ahead with something, and I might be in a spot where it'd be really tricky for me to tap out for a creature or something, you know, like tap out for my commander if I'm not holding up like Fierce or Swat or something. In first and second seat, you might be prioritizing pushing for a win more. You still can do that in the later seats, but again, it's always going to be contextual. It's going to be based on your deck, all these different things. All those things again mean seat order does matter. I guess in saying that seat order doesn't matter for win rate, then that's a little bit of a different statement, but related. But you can look at Kai's stats for win rate. Kai performs better in first and second seat than in third and fourth, pretty substantially. And I've kind of talked about the I'm just be built different, just win, whatever mentality. There's some reality to some of those things, but you got to kind of do it. If you just keep saying it online and you're not the one doing it, especially if you're going against the grain this much, kind of got to show how to do it, and the best way to do that is by doing it. Bailey Abner saying the barrier to greatness for a lot of players is they spend more time thinking about how their opponents threw the game instead of scrutinizing their own plays and decisions. I definitely think this is pretty accurate, and I think it's well voiced here too, because it didn't say the barrier to being a good player, it's the barrier to being a great player. Because I think a lot of players who are like kind of good, who are competent, they're the ones that kind of get wrapped up in the, oh, my opponents threw, oh, somebody else did something, because it is easy to, you know, if you do pretty well and you beat up your locals, and to kind of think of, you know, kind of get a little bit of a big head and, you know, not notice that maybe you're not as big of a fish, and you know, and as you think. But I can't speak to how many players actually do this, how big of a thing it is. We've talked about on the podcast, like self-awareness is your friend. Reflecting on what you can do. Sometimes again, the thing that you can do to do better is to help keep your opponents from throwing the game. If you can voice that, if you can politic well, state why you think they should do it, and give them good reason to listen to you, you can be better. And that's something I've really tried to implement, is trying to be better in those situations where those do come up. But overall, the more I reflect and the more I keep up with my games, the less that I see that, you know, I very rarely have the note of player B through the game to player A completely. And when I do, I usually have the note of I should have politic for XYZ and tried to show, you know, blah, blah, blah. Jay saying most players focus way too hard on not losing instead of winning. This is definitely true, especially, you know, like we can think about reactive and proactive decks and blah, 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 but every deck has, you know, free interaction, and every deck has really cheap and easy ways to win. Winning always has much bigger upside than not losing. There are spots and, you know, there's positions where you have to think about not losing. You have to be in the try not to die mode, as I like to call it. But whenever you're in that mode, always be considering when you're digging for your out that your best out is to win the game. And if you can, in a spot where you're working with the whole, pod to try to stop player one from winning, if you can put yourself into a position to like, oh, actually the best thing I can do here is just win on top of them. Consider that when you're thinking of your outs. It's really easy to get tunnel vision on trying to answer something. And a lot of times the best answer is giving your own question to the table. Memo saying, if you are the best player in your playgroup, you are in the wrong playgroup. If your goal is to get better, that's definitely the case. If your goal is to have fun and you just chill and you're, kind of casually invested in cEDH, then somebody's going to be the best and you don't necessarily have to, disregard your other players. Yeah, definitely the case. If you want to improve at the game, you need to find better players to play against. Ken Bauman saying, the only way to honestly and rigorously measure your skillfulness is to track and analyze your games. Pretty true. If you really want to do it, I do think alternatively, you could also just play a lot of events and that be, a decent way to, track your skillfulness, I guess. But definitely even part of that and succeeding in that aspect of the game, part of that is, hey, I have to actually be looking at what I did in those games and understand what went well, what went wrong, what did I do properly, what could I do better next time. I definitely think it helps out a lot. I've gotten a little lazy about it recently, but I definitely think it's something that will help you just when you develop that mindset. Track your games, it will help. Matt Sperling, building a deck is way more fun than playing the game. Sometimes wish cEDH was an auto battler. You're trying to turn cEDH into BGs, dude? Come on now. I feel almost the opposite, and some people responded to this talking about how they're comparing this sentiment to like casual commander and that being more the case. I think that's way more the case over there because it avoids it's basically like why you see a lot of casual players focus so much on, why you see so many casual players like build a million decks and probably not even play them all. It's why I used to do that, because it's a little bit, it is a bit of just a mental exercise that's just fun to think about. And a lot of times when you actually get into those games, you're never getting to you never get into magical Christmas land, and players are disruptive and players do this and do that, and then games don't play out the way you want. Maybe you didn't build it right, or blah blah blah, or you get into those power level discrepancy issues. And in cEDH, the list of staples that are basically like must run, it's just way too high to actually make it that mentally stimulating for building a list. I mean, it can be, for brewing something new, but like I really don't think there's that much space for super interesting brewing where your deck is like in similar colors to a staple list and you're 70 plus cards different. That's just not that likely to happen over here. So kind of disagree with this one. Welcome to TopDeck.gg, your community's home for everything competitive Magic has to offer. Whether you're hosting an event, playing for a huge prize, or trying to advertise your store to thousands of players, we've got you covered. Using intuitive pairing software, playing Magic is a breeze. All your players have to do is sign up online, then scan the QR code in store. Give your competitors the gift of perfect information as their bracket updates in real time. Then, when the match is decided, our self-reporting software saves you time and leaves paper match slips in the past. Leave the heavy lifting to us so your community can sit back, relax, and have a great day of playing Magic. This is one that I found to be kind of interesting. Voodoo Kick saying there aren't enough reputable and meaningful high-stakes tournament results to take the format specialists seriously yet, especially if the likes of Boschenroll can come rinse a room repeatedly with content creation as his main focus. Couple things to address, and I addressed it here with a response saying that rinsing happened a while ago, and Brian keeps entering events and keeps bringing Ken in and not doing especially well. But also Brian also does that in Vintage and Legacy. Like, are you discrediting all the Legacy and Vintage players because someone who focuses on content, or we're talking about someone like Comedian who does a whole lot of content creation and is one of the best cEDH players? Like, I think trying to discredit players because they focus on content creation or whatever is a little goofy. And then also, I think the argument that the good players aren't here yet is something I've talked about and something I've even give some credence to, and I don't think it's a very good one, because I think those players help to improve the game. And I think Brian Koval brought, a focus from, like maybe some legacy players and people. We got more eyes on the format, and that'll continue to happen. And I think it helped the format, but I don't think, and he'll even tell you this, there was a lot of cEDH specialists who helped him get into the game. I think this is a little bit too much discrediting the community, and 10Ks are 10Ks. Those are the bigger than the, we have a SCG con coming up where, cEDH being the main event. I don't really buy this. Magda is the best mid-range hell deck. Don't at me, coming from the Papa Squats Magda player. This is something I've wanted to talk about, sort of the rock, paper, scissors of cEDH having shifted to being about turbo mid-range and sort of what I like to think of as inevitability engines. Because even more so than Tymna Crom, Magda and cEDH and decks like that represent an inevitability to, if this game goes long enough, it will end because I will be able to end it. It's just in the zone. I don't even need to draw good cards. It'll just happen. And I think Magda and cEDH, specifically cEDH's popularity, have changed the format and have actually made turbo decks better because of these decks preying on mid-range draw card. And so yeah, I think Magda is a really good deck into the current format. MJ from MTG and Quarantine saying, don't let tournament results pigeonhole you into playing only proven decks. Shop around different decks / strategies and find what works for you, even if it's fringe or unproven strategies. Pretty reasonable advice. I do think for newer cEDH players, I think do the opposite of this, actually look for proven lists. I do think there are a lot of people in that sort of good to looking to get great range that are just so obsessed with the cards that are actually good and discredit so many people who try to either experiment with new cards or just experiment with something different, look at a different metagame. I've had people just tell me straight up that other countries' entire metagames look bad. I think that's outrageously small brain. I definitely think you should look at, other metagames, look into decks. A lot of times, I look at a lot of weird decks on the channel here. My biggest thing is trying to think of what is this offering? If I see something that looks weird to me, I'm trying to think of from the lens of, okay, let's assume they're right. What makes this right? Gold Sabertooth saying Tymna is more powerful than Rhystic Study. There's a couple ways to interpret this statement. Is Tymna as a card being legal to register more warping to a format than Rhystic Study? Arguably, the answer to that is yes. Maybe. Tymna Crom is an incredible partner selection. There aren't really many other Tymna decks that see a lot of success, so I don't think Tymna is the most warping it's ever been. I think there was a point where like TNK, Tymna Thras, Mad Farm variants, they're like really popular where there's just tons and tons of Tymna decks. They're not really as popular now. Bowmasters has kind of cleaned up a little bit of that. Things like that, just meta changes. I think Tymna is both less powerful in play than Rhystic Study, although it is a little bit passive. People don't freak out as much about Tymna. So Tymna can be sneakily powerful in play in a game that's going long where things aren't really happening. That's the strength of Tymna. It is like just based off your ability to push through damage. It's not really what your opponents are doing, beyond playing creatures and stuff. But Rhystic Study clearly has a much warping experience in play where it completely changes the thought process of every interaction. Every single thing that players do is now based around Rhystic Study. I think if Tymna was that strong, maybe we would be seeing it more in the 99, but there aren't that many white-black decks that, aren't Tymna in the zone, but we're not going to see like Tivit play Tymna, or, there were days where Najila played it, but so I'll slightly disagree here, but I think there's maybe a discussion for like, if we're looking at bannability, maybe. Captain Moral Support, Rhystic, Mystic, Esper, Dockside, Bowmasters don't need banned. People just need to play more responsibly. These are, I would say, 3 different types of cards, Rhystic, Mystic, Esper being their own, Dockside being their own, and Bowmaster being their own, that all punish completely different things that are all integral to playing the game. This is the first one I'm gonna get a little bit heated about. If you are casting a bunch of spells like rituals and trying to go off and blah, 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 you are most punished by Rhystic, Mystic, Esper. If you try to avoid that and you are, playing a more mid-rangey game where you're developing rocks and stuff, kind of more, slowly developing whatever, maybe you develop your own advantage engine, blah, 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 you are hard punished by Dockside Extortionist. If you try to play Mana Dorks and play a more creature-heavy plan, you are punished by Orcish Bowmasters. These all punish very different things, and you cannot play responsibly around all of them and actually play a game of Magic. If all of these are in play, you are just picking which way you want to die. And they are all very real cards that show up in every game. I don't think this is a real thing anymore. People are having to, Thrasios, X green decks are cutting down to just like 2 dorks, 3 dorks maybe, just to play with Orcish Bowmasters. There's no responsibility around it because if you're not triggering Bowmasters, it doesn't matter. It's still going to kill your creatures. Rhystic, Mystic, Esper punish you for someone else being irresponsible. That doesn't help you. Dockside Extortionist, you're not going to have a successful cEDH list that can avoid doing all of these things. Then responsibility isn't even a factor for a lot of them either with like Orcish Bowmasters. So I don't buy these. I think these are just cracked cards. I think Esper's maybe the outlier here in terms of power level. I think it's gone down a little bit in comparison to some of these cards. No, I don't think it's a responsibility thing. People say that a lot. I don't buy it. This is a pretty bad one in my opinion. The average cEDH player would be the worst player at a casual pod. Without the fast man and the expensive toys, cEDH players were struggles to compete and adapt to a complicated board state. How much more complicated is it going to be than Rhystic, Mystic, Dockside, blah, 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 all over the place? 67,000. Everybody's playing at instant speed. There's Born Upon. I played a game the other day where there were 3 Born Upon wins on the stack at the same time. You think you're getting that much more complicated than that? I don't really buy that one. Plus, also a lot of cEDH players play casual, but a lot of casual play is like done at sorcery speed. You know, there's a lot more developing to the board, so there can be a lot of things and triggers to keep up with. In my experience, most casual players don't really do that good of a job of keeping up with all their triggers and stuff, depending on your pod, but in terms of average random LGS play, it's very messy and loose. I don't find that I tend to underperform when I play casual. I don't play it a lot because I don't think it's that fun. For what I look for in Magic, I think most cEDH players handle themselves pretty well, especially considering most casual players are jamming all of these super broken staples in their decks anyways. Last time I played a casual game, 2 different players cast the Mana Crypt. cEDH mana bases are too greedy. If you're trying to cast Grand Abolisher, Dauthi Voidwalker, and Flesh Duplicate while using Mana Vault, Auto War, and only 27 lands, you're losing more games to your mana than you're willing to admit. Maybe prove it. There aren't a lot of decks that are looking to cast Grand Abolisher, Dauthi Voidwalker, and Flesh Duplicate all in the same deck. They do come up, but a lot of decks have moved off of Dauthi, and a lot of like the 4-color decks aren't playing Flesh Duplicate anyways. So it's mostly Grand Abolisher, and those decks are also looking to cast Ranger Captain. They're probably looking to cast Tymna or maybe Tivit. Double white is something they can work on. Those also aren't cards you're all necessarily looking to play very early on. You know, if Grand Abolisher was something that needed to play very quickly to get value, like Dauthi Voidwalker, that's more of a consideration because a turn 4 Dauthi Voidwalker is way worse than a turn 1 or 2 Dauthi Voidwalker. But those decks are pretty good at making black mana anyways. Black mana is kind of one of the easier ones to make, kind of next to colorless. If you do jam all these into your deck, yeah, it's going to mess you up. Otherwise, just avoid these double pip cards and stick to the really broken ones like Grand Abolisher. Wizards should oversee an official ban list / rulebook instead of letting Kitchen Table Magic make the rules for a format. Kitchen Table doesn't affect Standard, Modern, or Legacy. Why is Kitchen Table? Casual EDH, affect cEDH. Also, Iona can be unbanned. Iona thing obviously doesn't affect competitive. I'm not really going to talk about that at length. Wizards should oversee an official ban list. This is something I think is a win, not an if. You know, and this is something I haven't covered on the channel, but there's been a lot of talk on Twitter and, you know, in online spaces in general about the rules committee kind of having a lack of willingness to really do anything. They kind of just, it's easy to get the impression that they're just trying to keep up a streak of no changes to look at themselves as like, hey, look, we didn't need changes. We've done it. That means we've done it right, but we're the ones who decide that. Obviously, things like signpost bans, not a real thing that actual games or formats do. Doesn't make a whole lot of sense. That logic is kind of easily thrown out the window. I do think there's a little bit gained by Wizards by letting other people just take the flack for these decisions, but I think especially now as Commander is the moneymaker for your format, they allow the rules committee to exist. It's not the other way around. The rules committee isn't holding Wizards hostage. At any point, Wizards of the Coast can just say, we don't care about you guys anymore. We're going to do this. Arguably, they should. I don't think, especially now with Sheldon gone, I don't think the RC doesn't even have a real face. It's currently Jim, who's like one of the newer members, and who, you know, no shade here, was kind of a bit like an extreme yes man for the RC on Twitter all the time. It seems like the RC might be a little self-absorbed, stuck in their own ways, don't want to change anything, curmudgeon-y, however you want to put it. I wouldn't mind seeing this change. I don't know what actual impact it would have or what the philosophy changes would be, but also like, yeah, seeing the RC just go around in circles talking about their own philosophy while not doing anything whatsoever, it feels like they're thinking about, you know, how they would do something if there was something to do, and there is stuff to do. I hear, you know, CAG members talk about how miserable cards are, and they talk about them like, oh, there's nothing we can do. Rhystic Study is miserable, but I can't do anything about it. Like, you guys are the ones in charge, right? Just do something. It's a little tough to evaluate because we're comparing a potential what would Wizards do with this versus the reality that is kind of middling and weird and bad. I think we're getting closer to a point where a realistic ban list based on power level and stuff from Wizards of the Coast is more of a reality, but I think it might still be a little bit off. MTGPT, also known as TAD, saying cEDH land counts are higher than they need to be. Players will play a higher number of lands out of fear of mulliganing for a playable hand. I think there's some merit to this. In my deck construction, at least recently, I've found that I skew on the lower side, even of what, you know, outside of decks like Rogsai. Like when I picked up Rog Thras, I think Sam's list was early on like 29, and I wanted to move down to like 27-ish, which I think might be where they're at now. I do think that when winning is, you know, kind of good and pushing is a little bit better than sitting back, which I think we're in that space right now, you need to consider how many land drops you realistically want to make, how many lands you want to see in an opening hand. And one of the biggest things about this format is it is very high variance. You want to look at it more like vintage than like standard. Looking for broken cards and maybe losing a little bit of stability might be ideal, because going land drop, and that being your acceleration, that doesn't cut it. Playing playing on curve really does not cut it in cEDH. Very rarely does, at least. You shouldn't expect to do that consistently and see a really great win rate. You kind of have to take advantage of the fact that it's a broken format, and low land counts, having a higher density of rituals or, fast mana, whatever, is part of that. If you're cutting lands just for more spells that aren't even necessarily that broken, that's where like the evaluation kind of becomes a little tougher. Roxai, we play like 3 less lands than, most decks, but we also run like 4 or 5 more rituals than most decks. So like the mana count is still there. So that's a consideration too. Really, it's always, of course, gonna be context based, but I do think there's some merit to that. And if you're not sure, just experiment. If you want to play a whole bunch of games with 3 less lands or something in your list and build accordingly, and see how that feels and how that mulligans, try it out, right? Blood Moon is no longer cEDH playable. My response, unless your goal is to lose, and I'll stick with that. The best counterspell on an opponent's card is the one you didn't cast. Yeah, I've talked about this. I think there are a lot of players who are excited. When somebody casts a counterspell, there's 2 different ways they do it. Some people, they get to cast a counterspell, and some people, they have to cast a counterspell. And the people who get to do it are, on average, in my experience, worse players who are more likely to kind of get taken advantage of as the games go on. It's something you don't want to have to do, but sometimes you have to do it. It's okay to lose to fringe cards. Don't tech for everything. This is a big thing for me. And you can just replace this with stacks. I rarely lose to the stacks player, but a lot of times when I play, I will lose to the stacks effect, giving the other player the game. That's kind of the name of the game with stacks currently. If somebody plays a bad card and they don't win and you don't win, what are you going to do, right? Cowboy Bob saying most cEDH grinders are only good because they can politic and would be awful at 60 card formats where they can't use politics to win. Prove it. I do think there are a lot of grinders who really take advantage of politics and understand how to play with bad players, take advantage of a pod that has questionable threat assessment or is kind of looking at the table for what to do. There's also a lot of people who I think kind of just take advantage of, if you lose round 1 or something and you kind of get into those, lower tier pods, and then you just like mind control those players and then just shake your hands way up to the top. I think some aspect of this is more about that element where you just have to sneak in a couple wins and then you just shake hands the way to the top. Would they be awful at 60 card formats? Maybe, but like if they don't play it, who cares? Is that relevant? Most cEDH decks care too much about perfect mana and running more than 25 lands in a draw/tutor heavy format is bad deck building. 28 lands or higher tells me you're addicted to drawing bad cards. Hey, a land is like a mox that doesn't even trigger a Rhystic Study. I mean, come on now. More people talking about low land counts. The average cEDH player does not understand the fundamentals about Magic. They enter into a format that requires deep understanding of mechanics, but because of proxies, they don't actually have to invest. They had us in the first half, not gonna lie. Proxies have absolutely nothing to do with your level of investment intellectually into a game. You don't have to be financially invested in something to be emotionally invested in something. People spend all day sitting in Discord playing cEDH that don't own any cEDH cards. That's just a thing. That's a fact. That's something I can point to. I can find you somebody and say, this is one of those people. What you're saying does not have any merit that I can see. There is maybe some discussion about people entering the format not having great understanding of the fundamentals about Magic. And I think that's more something you see from people who enter through casual Commander who don't play a 60 card format and who don't play at any sort of, rules enforcement level where they kind of just play so loose and build in very, sort of cutesy ways that when they come into cEDH, it can be, a rude awakening for them. And there's a lot of learning to do and a lot of unlearning to do. Maybe some merit to that. Absolutely none of it has to do with proxies. Thras' Oracle is a plan B at most. People overrate it too much. I do think it's usually a plan B because breach is usually just safer and better to do. I mean, it is still really busted. This is one I think I agree with. The gulf between the best deck in the format and the worst deck in the format is much smaller than people think. Depending on your definition of worst deck in the format, if that is like a relevant player in the metagame, meaning like something that shows up in top 16s but isn't exactly that common, doesn't have the best conversion rate, probably true. A lot of times the difference between those decks are just some level of consistency brought about by the commanders, right? Tymna probably are on average just better than the commanders they're bringing, or maybe their deck is too built around their commanders because it's some kind of synergistic pile and it just all the pieces aren't really that high in card quality and just the level of consistency is not quite there, but the power level of cards, it's high all across the board. If you're playing Mana Crypt, you're playing Mox Diamond, you're playing Rhystic Mystic, Underworld Breach, blah, blah, blah. Your deck's going to be really good in some games. You're going to be able to win games because you have powerful cards. I mean, this is pretty accurate. I also think the other side of this is saying that the best deck and the worst deck play really similarly because they do use a lot of similar cards in a lot of instances, unless you're talking about playing like a hard dedicated stacks deck, but those decks don't top 16, so who cares? So why not play a better deck is a lot of times the question I ask people, because I think in a lot of formats, you can point to the best deck and say, I don't really like how that plays. Or you point to the meta decks and say, I don't really enjoy those decks. You know, they're not quite my play style. And you have dedicated people who will play, you know, some weird, you know, fringe combo deck in Legacy, or some, you know, kind of aggro deck that's just a little bit behind of what's, you know, popular in Modern or what's powerful right there. And they just stick to their deck because they enjoy how it plays. In cEDH, almost all these decks play the same. There's almost no reason to play a different deck than, you know, something that has top 16 this year. You know, if you're playing some weird Jeskai commander just to prove that you're different, how different are you than Tymna? Are you really that much different? Probably not. This take feels cold to me, but people are still not grasping how important table talk and politics are, while scratching their head wondering how some individuals can consistently top events in such a variance-filled environment. It is on the colder side. Yeah, there are people who don't get it, but there are just a lot of people who just want to opt out of it because they don't enjoy that experience. And if that is the case, I'm not going to tell you do something you don't enjoy. Do something that will make you enjoy this game that you are spending your time on even less. If you want to opt out of that and you're okay understanding that, you know, you might be losing a few percentage points here and there, keep doing what you're doing. I don't think you have to be forced to politic or make small talk or do anything at the table you don't want to do. So play the way that you want to. Understand though that you might be losing some equity, especially depending on, you know, the deck that you're playing. This is an interesting one. cEDH gravitating towards a tournament format has done more harm than good for the community as a whole. I disagree. They're not really giving me any evidence to point towards. They're not saying because X, you know, so I can't really dispute the reason that you think it is because you didn't give me one. But I think the word community is now way more applicable for cEDH because it's a tournament format. One of the things that I've talked about is that events that people look forward to, you know, big moments for a community, are a part of a community. If we're all just playing on spell table, you know, or random discords or whatever, cEDH was way more like private and click based or whatever beforehand. I mean, now we do have like private playtest groups and stuff like that, but a lot of those are big. Those are like 30 to 100 people or something potentially, right? Those are communities, and those communities have a focus and structure that a tournament provides them. If your issue with, you know, it being a tournament format is that decks now are way less interesting or blah, 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 that's just an inevitability of any format of Magic as people play it more. There's not really anything you can do about that. That's just going to happen because people will get better at a game and people will optimize it, and that's how games work. But in terms of like actually creating a community, I think tournaments are, you know, pretty pivotal because that's the main way to structure events for a community like this that's built around a game, right? If there were some other better way to structure an event that made a lot of sense that players really would have, you know, preferred, then maybe that thing would be better for the community. But just sitting around and playing on spell table, or, you know, I mean, what else do we do as a community for cEDH play? Do we just show up and play unstructured? All we're doing is doing that, but for money and prizes. It's basically the same thing, except it's way easier to wrap your head around and way more interesting to plan your weekend around. And you have this kind of positive one that I really like here. It's not even necessarily that much of a hot take, but it's a take. There is no in between in cEDH. You get 100% proxy decks or people with foil, foreign, signed, altered, artist proof decks. Like, rarely do I see someone with just a deck of cards not in one of those categories. All are accepted, and that's what's great about cEDH. I do think that's a great thing about cEDH. There is a wide variety of players. When I go to events, I see people who are super young. I see kids there. I see people who are like into their 60s at tournaments. A way higher density of like women at events, and people of, you know, all sorts of different identities and different backgrounds, and like all different kinds of people, and they all express themselves differently in Magic. You see, I show up to events with my proxied up Japanese future sight Tymna that, you know, a lot of people get fun out of. A lot of people really prefer just blinging out their, you know, preferred versions of cards. There's all kinds of different people who experience the format in different ways, and I really do like that. Didn't get to all of these. There's a bunch of them that kind of go into that, like cEDH would be better if other people did the rules and rules committee stuff and blah, blah, blah. And maybe arguably that Commander would be better. I don't want to go into all of those and address all the slightly different takes on that. This is a pretty funny one. Most players are getting top 16/4s off of draws. If they have the same rule set as Hallelujah or Hair Ryu, whatever, we would see most Japanese events. We would see most of our favorite content creators make 23rd place, etc. Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say would X player, you know, which players would do better or worse after this, but it is a completely different tournament when everybody has to play all their games. Obviously, that's going to impact, you know, who performs well. I still expect a lot of good players to do well. It's going to completely change how tournaments are structured. And I think, you know, experimenting with that over here, it's something that I've talked about and still interested in seeing. Rog Thras, the most underrated deck in the format currently? I don't think so at this point. I think 2/3 Nelson saying Rog Thras is the most underrated deck in the format currently. I think we're a little bit past that. I think there was a point earlier this year where that was the case. I think a lot of the very casually invested people, they might still be missing it. Like a lot, like if I bring it up to events or just bring it and play with randoms, they might think that I'm playing the polymorph variant. They don't understand or they don't know about the newer builds. But I think people who are paying attention, who look at top 16s like I do, see that like, hey, this in a very short period of time got a lot of top 16s. I topped with it. I think Nelson here topped with it. Like a lot of people have had good runs with it at events. You know, Gold Sabretooth's been playing it, Rebel's been playing it, Sam Black's been doing well with it. And people have seen that like, oh, this is actually a real deck and an archetype that actually has something going for it. I think it's getting a bit more recognition. So I wouldn't say maybe the most underrated deck, though I don't know what I would say the most underrated deck is, but maybe it's up there. It's maybe the most overlooked top tier deck at the moment. Let me know down below what you think of these hot takes, which ones you agree with, disagree with. Let me know what your hot takes are as well. I'll try to get down in the comments. If you guys go too crazy on them, I might not be able to reply to all of them, and if I should do more videos like this, talking about the community takes and things like that, maybe elaborating on some of these topics that got brought up repeatedly, let me know what you want to hear about. But with all that being said, thank you so much for watching. And as always, go play cEDH. Have a good one, everybody.